The storm above the great hall had teeth. It worried at the battlements and clawed at the high windows until the glass sang faintly in its frames. Beyond the enchanted ceiling, black clouds rolled over one another in bruised layers, lit now and then by white, vein-thin forks of lightning. The first years kept looking up as if expecting the weather to break through and fall among the floating candles. Harry scarcely blamed them. Everything about the evening felt 1 inch removed from the ordinary, as though the school had resumed its familiar shape after the summer, only because no better disguise had yet been prepared. He sat between Ron and Hermione at the Gryffindor table and let the noise of the feast wash past him without quite joining it. The long journey north still seemed lodged in his bones, along with the summer that had preceded it. Privet Drive, the Dementors in the alley, the hearing. The cold fury of being kept in ignorance while the world shifted underneath him. Hogwarts ought to have felt like release. Instead, it felt like arriving at a fortress whose gates were still open only because the enemy had not yet finished choosing the lock. Hermione, who had been trying and failing to restore some sense of term-beginning normality since they boarded the train, leaned across him to point out the third-year Hufflepuffs whispering over a bowl of trifle as though it might explode. Ron laughed. Harry made a sound that could have passed for amusement and looked toward the staff table. Dolores Umbridge was impossible to miss. Everything about her appeared calculated to reassure a person with bad instincts. The little bow fixed in her hair, the pink cardigan stretched over a body shaped like a stout child's toy, the clasped hands, the smile that never widened enough to show any true warmth, and therefore never risk disorder. She did not sit like a teacher. She sat like an observer allowed into the room on the understanding that she would soon be allowed to rearrange it. Dumbledore, silver-bearded and grave in the candlelight, might have balanced her by his very presence in any previous year. Tonight, even his serenity seemed to sharpen the unease rather than soothe it. He looked older to Harry than he had in June. Not weaker, never that, but more remote, as though some part of him had gone away to stand watch and not yet return. The sorting concluded. Plates filled. Students ate with the relieved greed of children who had traveled all day. Harry had just reached mechanically for a roast potato when a movement along the side wall caught his eye. 2 men in ministry plums stood half in shadow near the small door used by servants and house elves. They were not Aurors. Moody had taught him too much in a single school year for Harry to mistake that particular breed of vigilance. These men had the look of clerks who had learned to carry themselves as enforcers. One held a leather folio under his arm. The other was speaking in a low voice to Filch, who nodded repeatedly with an expression of greedy importance. Neither man belonged in the great hall on the first night of term. "What?" Hermione murmured, following his gaze. He tipped his head toward them. Ron looked too. "Ministry?" Ron said under his breath. "Probably couriers," Hermione said at once, though not very convincingly. "There was all that business at the hearing, and Fudge has been interfering in everything else. Maybe they're delivering papers." "At supper?" Before Hermione could answer, Dumbledore rose. The usual welcome came first. The caution against entering the forbidden forest. The reminder that Filch still considered joy a disciplinary matter. The announcement of staffing changes. When Dumbledore named Dolores Umbridge as the new defense against the dark arts teacher, the applause that followed was sparse and uncertain. Umbridge placed one plump hand theatrically to her chest. Harry did not clap at all. Then she stood to speak. Her voice had the prim, pleased little trill of a teacup rattling in its saucer. She talked about progress and tradition in the same breath, about standards, partnership, responsible guidance, and the duty of educational institutions to cooperate harmoniously with the Ministry for Magic in times of public unease. At first, the speech seemed merely dull. Then Harry saw Hermione stiffen beside him. The dullness was a method. Beneath every harmless phrase there ran a harder thread. Schools did not belong to themselves. Independence could be recast as irresponsibility. Oversight was kindness when authority chose to describe it that way. A few students had stopped pretending to listen. Some were openly bored. Percy would have loved it, Harry thought viciously. But at the edges of the hall, adults were not bored. Professor McGonagall's mouth was a thinner line than usual. Snape's expression was unreadable. Hagrid, immense and shaggy at the far end of the table, appeared mostly interested in a plate of chops. Flitwick alone looked openly worried. When Umbridge finished, there was a patter of confused applause. She sat, and as she did so, one of the ministry men by the side wall made a note in his folio. Harry looked at Dumbledore. The headmaster did not look back. He thanked everybody in a mild voice and dismissed them to bed as if the evening had contained nothing more consequential than treacle tart. The first notice went up before the puddles in the entrance hall had dried from the students' cloaks. It was pinned crookedly to the central board beside the staircase and sealed with fresh red wax. By the time Harry, Ron, and Hermione reached it, a crowd had already formed. The parchment crackled when the draft touched it. Educational Decree Number 22nd, Hermione read under her breath. All student societies, clubs, teams, and organized gatherings are henceforth suspended pending registration and explicit approval by the Office of Educational Standards and Student Welfare. That can't mean Quidditch, Ron said at once. It says all, Hermione replied. Harry read the line again and felt the same hot, unreasonable anger that had been his companion all summer stir under his ribs. Organized gatherings. Not riots. Not dark rituals. Gatherings. The feast wasn't over 10 minutes ago, he said. That's exactly the point, said a cool, drawling voice from behind them. Draco Malfoy stood with Crabbe and Goyle, wearing the look of somebody who had discovered that a game he had long played in private was finally about to be made official. Some people need rules before they remember how to behave. Ron turned so fast, Harry thought for a moment they would be fighting on the stairs before term had properly started. Hermione caught his sleeve. Harry merely looked at Draco and saw, with unpleasant clarity, not triumph but anticipation. Draco had known something. Perhaps not the details, but enough to arrive ready for them. "Do you ever get tired of sounding like a pamphlet?" Harry asked. Draco's smile sharpened. "Do you ever get tired of being the reason everybody has to suffer?" Crabbe laughed too early, as he did with all jokes, whether he understood them or not. Students pressed past on either side, reading the decree, whispering, moving on. The thing about institutions, Harry thought suddenly, was that they did not need to shout when they meant to frighten people. They only needed to be there in writing where everyone must pass. Hermione dragged them away before Ron could answer. The common room later was full of indignant speculation. Would gobstones count? What about dueling club? What about choir? What about study groups? But none of it had the healthy, argumentative energy that usually attended school complaints. There was too much caution in it. Too many glances toward the portrait hole every time footsteps sounded outside. Long after the room had quieted and the fire had sunk to embers, Harry lay awake listening to rain batter the tower windows. Dean snored softly across the room. Seamus muttered in his sleep. Ron turned over and kicked the footboard once. Harry ought to have slept. Instead, he found himself thinking of the men in plum, of the folio, of Umbridge's speech disguised as porridge. At last he got up, dragged on his glasses, and went to the window. The grounds below were black with wet. Lightning flickered far off over the mountains. Most of the castle windows were darkening one by one, but down near the entrance hall, a pale oblong of light remained. Harry squinted. A figure crossed it, Filch, unmistakable in outline. Behind him came one of the ministry men carrying not the folio now, but a flat brass-bound case. A second figure followed, shorter, pinker. Umbridge. They disappeared from sight. Harry stood for a long moment with one hand on the cold glass. The castle had survived curses, sieges, mad governors, and a basilisk in the pipes. He knew all that. He knew, too, that Hogwarts was full of hidden doors, secret loyalties, old magic that did not answer readily to bureaucrats. Yet something had crossed the threshold all the same, and it had not come with a curse or a scream. It wore a ministry badge. The next morning brought thin sunlight, a sky rinsed clear by the storm, and the kind of brittle cold that made every window pane in the castle glow with trapped silver. None of it improved Harry's temper. The timetable pinned to the notice board outside the common room might as well have been a list of minor irritations carefully arranged to culminate in catastrophe. Double potions with Slytherin. History of magic. Then, after lunch, the first defense against the dark arts lesson under Dolores Umbridge. Ron looked at the entry and made a face as though he had bitten unexpectedly into soap. Hermione, though still offended on behalf of every school society in Britain, attempted optimism. "We don't know she'll be awful," she said. Harry looked at her. "All right," Hermione amended. "We know she'll be awful. We don't know the precise nature of the awfulness." By lunchtime, they knew. The defense classroom had changed overnight. The cages once occupied by various alarming creatures were gone. The smell of singed feathers and stale spellwork had been replaced by something powdery and floral, as if the room had been scrubbed with perfume until even the walls had surrendered. Decorative plates of kittens wearing bows purred around the skirting boards. On the blackboard, in neat looping script, someone had written, "Progress for a better future." A ripple of repulsion moved through the class. Harry took his seat and felt it harden. Umbridge entered carrying a clipboard. She wore a pink cardigan even frillier than the night before, and a look of smug cheerfulness that seemed to draw energy from everybody else's discomfort. Without preamble, she instructed them to take out the ministry-approved text and begin Chapter 1. Foundational Principles for Defensive Theory. For 10 minutes, nothing happened but page-turning. The silence grew strained. Harry read the first paragraph 3 times, and retained only that it had been written by someone who believed danger was most properly addressed at a safe intellectual distance. At last, Hermione raised her hand. Umbridge looked delighted, as if this had been staged for her. "Yeah." "Excuse me, Professor," Hermione said, very polite and very careful. "But aren't we going to practice any defensive spells? I can hardly imagine a situation arising in my classroom that would require you to use a defensive spell, Miss Granger." "No, but outside the classroom." "There is nothing outside this classroom," said Umbridge sweetly. "That should concern you more than your examinations." A few students shifted uncomfortably. Harry felt the old fury waking. Ron put up a hand. "What if we're attacked?" Umbridge's smile acquired edges. "By whom?" Nobody answered that. Saying Voldemort's name in front of her would have been like dropping fire into lamp oil. Harry heard himself speak before he had decided to. "By him." The room changed. Even the kitten plates seemed to go still. Umbridge turned to him with an almost maternal regret. "Ah, of course. I ought to have anticipated this particular fantasy from you, Mr. Potter." "It's not a fantasy. It is a story," she said, "that has caused far too much alarm already. He killed Cedric Diggory." Several people looked down at their desks. Co's shoulders tightened in the row behind him. Umbridge clicked her tongue. "That is enough. This class is not the place for attention-seeking emotionalism." Harry stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "You can call it whatever you like," he said, and heard Ron make a low warning noise beside him. "But it happened. He's back, and everyone who pretends otherwise is either lying or frightened. It was a mistake, of course. One of the clear, ringing mistakes that still feel righteous when one is 15 and therefore offer no comfort once made." Umbridge's face had gone very pink indeed, though her voice remained controlled. "Detention this evening, Mr. Potter. My office. 5 o'clock. The rest of the lesson passed in a glaze of fury. By the time the bell rang, Harry wanted to hex the lot of them. Umbridge, Fudge, the textbook, the purring plates, perhaps the entire concept of floral stationery. Hermione tried to catch his sleeve on the way out. "You shouldn't have stood up," she whispered urgently. "Yes, because that's obviously the problem." "The problem," she said through her teeth, "is that she was waiting." He shook her off and went to potions with his anger still hot enough to steam. Snape did not improve it. Nothing in his classroom ever improved anything. He swept among the cauldrons with his usual air of contemptuous omniscience, while the Slytherins smirked and the Gryffindors tried not to explode either their mixtures or themselves. Harry ruined a shrinking solution by slicing the daisy roots too thick. Snape deducted points without looking at him. Perhaps, Snape said softly as he passed. If your energies were devoted more often to instruction than performance, Potter, you might progress beyond basic incompetence. Harry's hand closed so tightly round his knife that his knuckles whitened. For one wild instant he wanted to turn and say that Snape, of all people, ought to recognize what happened when truth was treated as insolence. But Snape had moved on, and the words remained in Harry's throat like ash. Umbridge's office was on the 3rd floor in a room that had once belonged to some long-departed school administrator, and now looked as though a sweet shop had died there. Lace covers, china plates, ornamental kittens, the scent of something sugary and stale. It was not merely ugly. It was a kind of occupation in itself, a declaration that taste and power need have no relation to one another whatsoever. She set him lines, not with an ordinary quill. Harry realized that only when his first stroke across the parchment sent a blaze of pain across the back of his hand. He jerked, stared, and saw the words "I must not tell lies" appearing not only on the page, but cut into his skin in fine red letters. Umbridge watched with half-lidded satisfaction. "You will find, Mr. Potter, that repetition leaves a deeper impression than argument." He looked up at her, breathing hard. "You're mad." "No," she said, smiling. "I am consistent." He wrote until his hand shook. He wrote until the blood-wet words on the parchment blurred. He wrote until his anger ceased to feel hot and became instead something colder, denser, more dangerous. When at last she dismissed him, she advised him with false gentleness not to waste the lesson by complaining. Harry did not. He had no wish to tell her that it had not been a lesson, only a threat with stationery. He wrapped his hand in his robe sleeve on the way back to Gryffindor Tower. It was past supper. The castle had grown quiet in that conspiratorial way it sometimes did on weeknights, as if every closed classroom door concealed not essays and inkwells, but a separate plot. He nearly made it to the portrait hole unnoticed. Ginny saw him first. "You look awful," she said at once from her place by the fire. Ron and Hermione turned. The room's warm glow, the chatter, the normal clutter of homework and exploding snap cards, all of it made the pain in Harry's hand seem somehow more obscene. "I'm fine," he said. "You're white as the bloody Baron," said Ron. "What'd she do?" "Nothing." Hermione came closer. "Harry." He hated the note in her voice, because it meant she already knew the answer would matter. "Just detention." "With what?" Ginny asked. "Thumbscrews?" "Go away," Harry muttered. Hermione did not. She caught his wrist with startling swiftness and pulled his hand into the light before he could stop her. The cut words stood out livid and precise across the back of his skin. Ron swore. Ginny went very still. Hermione's face changed with extraordinary speed from horror to fury, so cold it looked almost scholarly. "We're telling McGonagall," she said. "No, we are." "No, we're not." Ron sprang to his feet. "I'll kill her." "You'll do nothing of the sort," Hermione snapped, then rounded on Harry again. "Why wouldn't you tell?" "Because that's what she wants." The answer came out harsher than he intended, but it was true. He could feel it. Complaint would be fed back into some report about instability, defiance, emotional volatility. "She wants me to make a fuss so she can punish me more." Ginny, who had been looking at the wound with narrowed eyes, said quietly, "That doesn't mean she gets to carve you up." For a second, Harry nearly gave in. The common room was warm, and his hand hurt, and the thought of McGonagall seeing the quill and turning her formidable wrath on Umbridge was almost unbearably tempting. Then he remembered the men in Plum, the first decree pinned up before the feast dishes were cleared, the feel of deliberate machinery moving into place. "No," he said again. Hermione stared at him as if he were being stubborn for sport, which, in a sense, he was not. He was being stubborn because he had spent too much of the summer helpless in official rooms and had developed a hatred of being handled. At length she took a bottle of Dittany from her bag, dabbed the wound with hands that trembled only once, and said nothing more. The next day, McGonagall noticed anyway. It happened in Transfiguration when Harry's hands spasmed slightly during a vanishing exercise, and the matchbox he was meant to be erasing turned bright orange instead. McGonagall was at his desk in 2 strides. "Is there some problem, Potter?" "No, Professor." Her eyes, sharp as pins behind square spectacles, dropped to his sleeve, where the cuff sat awkwardly over the bandage Hermione had insisted on. For one dangerous instant, Harry thought she knew everything. Perhaps she did. Perhaps there were things adults recognized not by evidence but by long unhappy familiarity. "See me after class," she said. He did. She asked him, in a voice clipped enough to remove any comfort from the experience, whether Umbridge's detentions were proceeding in accordance with ordinary school practice. Harry said yes. It was the only time in his life he had ever lied to McGonagall and felt ashamed before the sentence was half complete. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Very well," in a tone that meant the opposite. As he left, he saw her looking not at her papers but toward the window. Jaw set. That evening, on his way to dinner, Harry saw Lucius Malfoy coming out of Dumbledore's office. The sight struck him like cold water. Lucius descended the moving staircase with the insolent ease of a man to whom schools, governments, and other people's homes had all too often been obliged to open themselves. His pale hair shone like metal in the torchlight. Beside him walked Umbridge, pink and simpering, and one of the ministry men from the feast. Filch followed with a sheaf of parchment hugged to his chest. They had not seen Harry. He stood behind a suit of armor and listened. "Too much latitude among the students," Lucius was saying in the drawling, cultivated voice Harry hated almost as much as Snape's. "One hears of gatherings, of discussions, of the most regrettable rumors left unchallenged. If the school cannot manage itself, the ministry will naturally have to assist." Umbridge made a little sound of eager agreement. "I am certain a firmer hand will do wonders." "And the headmaster?" asked the ministry man. Lucius's mouth curved. "The headmaster has long confused indulgence with benevolence." They moved on. Harry remained where he was until their footsteps had faded entirely. When he reached supper, Hermione took one look at his face and said, "What now?" He told them in a low voice. Ron nearly choked on his pumpkin juice. What was Malfoy doing up there? "Helping," Harry said bitterly. "That's what men like him always call it." Hermione's gaze had gone distant in the way it did when pieces were fitting together faster than she could yet name them. Decrees, oversight, detentions, ministry officials in the corridors, Lucius visiting the headmaster's office, she said. "This isn't just a teacher being dreadful." "What is it then?" Ron demanded. Hermione looked at Harry. "It's preparation," she said. "And if they won't teach us to deal with what's coming, we may have to learn some other way." October hardened into November, and Hogwarts changed its habits. At first, the changes were small enough to be dismissed by anyone inclined toward dismissal. A new notice outside the owlry reminding students that all posts remain subject to routine review. 2 plum-cloaked officials installed, supposedly temporarily, in the suite of guest rooms off the second-floor corridor. A request that heads of house submit updated lists of all extracurricular affiliations among their students. Filch prowling after supper with more purpose than usual in a ring of keys swollen by several additions. Nothing dramatic. Nothing, taken alone, that could not be explained as bureaucracy having one of its periodic attacks of self-importance. But schools were built on pattern, and pattern once altered told on itself quickly. Students who had never before cared who crossed a corridor began noticing the same ministry faces appearing at the same junctions. A Ravenclaw 7th year found a package from home resealed with the wrong wax. Justin Finch Fletchley received 2 letters on the same day, one clearly opened and one delayed. A pair of 5th-year Hufflepuffs trying to organize a study circle for arithmancy were instructed to complete a 6-page approval form and submit the names of all likely attendees. Hermione borrowed the form and returned from the library so furious she had to sit down before she spoke. "They ask whether members have shown signs of political agitation," she said. Ron, who had been attempting to charm a broken quill back into usefulness, looked up blankly. "For a study group? For an arithmancy study group?" Harry took the parchment from her. In neat official boxes, it requested names, houses, purpose, supervising staff member, estimated duration, possible discussion topics, and whether any student involved had attracted prior disciplinary concern. The last category seemed to glow on the page. "This isn't school discipline," Hermione said. "It's siege work." She was right, and Harry thought of the phrase often over the weeks that followed. Umbridge's detentions continued. She arranged them on irregular evenings, as though unpredictability itself were part of the punishment. Harry learned to wrap his hand before bed without looking at it too closely. He learned to write around the pain in class. He learned, worst of all, how quickly even outrage could be worn into routine if no one was allowed to do anything useful with it. Ron remained perpetually ready to start a fistfight with any available surface. Hermione's anger changed shape and became method. Ginny, who understood humiliation better than either of them ever fully would, said little and watched everything. Then, Educational Decree Number 23 named Dolores Umbridge High Inquisitor of Hogwarts. The announcement was read aloud at breakfast by Professor McGonagall, in a voice so controlled it rendered every syllable a separate act of disdain. Umbridge smiled over her tea. Several Slytherins applauded. The ministry officials by the doors took notes. Harry looked at the teacher's table and saw something pass between Dumbledore and McGonagall. Nothing dramatic, no signal, merely recognition. The kind shared by people who know a line has just been crossed, and will now have to determine whether crossing it is reversible. Inspections began that afternoon. Umbridge visited lessons with a clipboard and a cough, writing little comments while teachers carried on under her gaze with varying degrees of hostility or strain. Trelawney looked faintly, as though she had swallowed one of her sherry bottles whole. Flitwick attempted civility, which only made Umbridge condescend harder. Snape endured the process with an expression of such poisonous patience that even Umbridge seemed uncertain whether she enjoyed baiting him. McGonagall met every question as if it were being asked by an unusually persistent insect. Harry, passing the second-floor landing after charms one evening, found Lucius Malfoy there again. This time he stood not beside Umbridge, but beside one of the newly installed ministry officers, a stooping man with an air of bureaucratic gratitude toward his own importance. Lucius held a rolled parchment in one gloved hand. The man was nodding eagerly. "Temporary provisions only," the officer was saying. "Until confidence is restored." Lucius's mouth barely moved. Temporary powers have a habit of lingering when properly administered. He glanced up, saw Harry at the far end of the landing, and smiled with the mild insolence of a man caught precisely where he wished to be seen. Harry kept walking because not walking would have been weakness. As he passed, Lucius said, "Mr. Potter, still attracting difficulty, I see." "You bring enough for everyone," Harry said. The officer beside him made an outraged noise. Lucius only inclined his head slightly, as though they were discussing weather, and Harry felt as he continued down the corridor that there were few things colder in the world than adults who had fused their charm to contempt. It was after that encounter that Hermione forced the matter. They were in the library under Madame Pince's vulturine supervision, supposedly researching counter curses for a defense essay that no one respected. Outside the windows, dusk had thickened to early dark. Inside, the lamps cast green pools over the tables. Harry sat with his scarred hand hidden under one sleeve and stared at a page without reading it. Ron across from him was attempting to study while visibly imagining Draco Malfoy falling down several staircases. Hermione closed her book. "Enough." Madame Pince looked up sharply from the desk. Hermione lowered her voice by a degree and continued. "We can't go on like this." Ron blinked. "Like what?" "Like this," Hermione repeated, pretending the only problem is that Umbridge is vile. They're building something around us, and none of it is meant to help. Harry's right about you-know-who. The ministry's wrong. Defense classes are a joke. And every week they get a little more control over what students can say, where they can go, and who they can speak to. Monsieur. Harry shifted, uncomfortable not because she was wrong, but because she was saying aloud what he had been carrying around in pieces for weeks. "What do you want us to do? Hex them?" "Not yet," said Ginny, appearing between the stacks so suddenly that Ron nearly yelped. She dropped into the chair beside Hermione as if she had been part of the conversation all along. "But I know 3 second years who still think a shield charm is something you wear." Ron glared. "How long have you been listening?" "Long enough." Hermione folded her hands. "Harry should teach us." He stared at her. "Don't be ridiculous." "I'm not being ridiculous." "You are. There are teachers." Hermione's eyes flashed. "Are? That shut him up." "Look," she said, leaning forward, voice low and urgent. "Not a formal club. Not with approval forms and lists and all the rest of it. Just people who want to learn properly. Real defensive magic. The things you've actually used." Harry let out a disbelieving breath. "I'm not a teacher." "No," said Ginny, maddeningly calm. "You're the person in this school who's faced the things the rest of us are being told don't exist." Ron straightened. "She's got a point." Harry looked from one to the other and found no rescue in any face. Even Neville, who had drifted over under the pretense of shelving a book, was hovering within earshot with a hopeful misery that made refusal feel like cruelty. "It'll get people in trouble," Harry said. "We're already in trouble," Neville said unexpectedly. The quiet conviction in his voice did more than persuasion from anyone else might have done. Harry thought of Neville's parents, of the hard set of his mouth whenever the war was spoken of in hints rather than names. He thought too of his own detentions, of Umbridge's denial, of Lucius on the landing with a rolled parchment and a smile. Hermione saw him wavering and pressed on. "We don't need dozens, just enough to matter. We meet off school grounds first, Hogsmeade, somewhere nobody would think much of students gathering." "The 3 broomsticks will be packed," said Ron. "Hogshead," said Ginny at once. They all turned to look at her. "What?" she said. "No one who likes clean glasses goes there, which seems ideal." Harry almost laughed. The feeling startled him. Laughter had become rare enough to seem borrowed from somebody else's life. "And what am I supposed to do if people show up? Stand on a table and announce my credentials?" Hermione's expression softened, though only slightly. "You tell the truth. Then you show them one spell that might save them." Once the idea existed, it spread with frightening speed. "Not publicly. Never that." Hermione moved through the castle with the stealth of a person smuggling embers under her coat. She mentioned the meeting to trusted people in 1s and 2s. Neville, Dean, Parvati, Lavender, the Creevies, Justin, Ernie Macmillan, Hannah Abbott, Susan Bones, Luna Lovegood, who accepted the suggestion as if secret defense leagues were entirely ordinary features of school. Ginny spoke to younger students. Ron reluctantly canvassed among 5th-year boys who were willing to learn as long as they could pretend they had thought of it first. Harry did nothing except dread the outcome and then, slowly, dread it less. Cho found him outside the Great Hall on a wet Wednesday evening. "I heard there's a Hogsmeade meeting," she said. There was no accusation in her voice, only directness. Cedric's death lay between them like a room they had both entered and neither knew how to leave. "Maybe," Harry said. Cho studied him for a moment. "I'll come." Then, after the smallest hesitation, "Can my friend come too?" "Marietta." "She's not. She just wants to know what's going on." "Me." "Oh." Harry thought of opened letters, of questions on ministry forms, of Lucius smiling from the landing. But refusing Cho at once felt both impossible and unfair. "All right," he said. The next evening, Hermione appeared with a scrap of parchment covered in names. Not the names themselves, she assured him immediately, only initials and tally marks, because she was not mad. There were more interested people than Harry had expected. Far more. "They all know what happened at the Triwizard tournament," Hermione said quietly as they stood near a window overlooking the rain-streaked grounds. "And even the ones who don't believe every detail believe the ministry's lying about something. You can feel it now." He could. Hogwarts still looked like Hogwarts. Stairs that changed their minds. Ghosts drifting through doors. The smell of toast at breakfast. Peeves throwing chalk at first years. But the ordinary magic of the place had begun to share space with something meaner and more deliberate. More locked doors, more written instructions, more adults speaking to one another in the corridor and falling silent when students passed. On Friday, Harry used the invisibility cloak to follow one of the ministry men from the second floor to the old classroom beside Umbridge's office. The door, which had once stored damaged desks, now bore a new brass plaque. Educational Security Liaison. Through the keyhole, he saw shelves installed, parchment stacked, sealed boxes labeled with dates. Heard voices. Filch, ... Umbridge. Another man whose tone was too low to place. At one point, a name floated clear. Malfoy believes. Harry jerked back before he could hear the rest. A floorboard had creaked under his shoe. For one frozen moment, he was certain the door would fly open. It did not. But he returned to Gryffindor Tower with the distinct sensation that the school had grown another organ somewhere in its body, and that the organ's entire function was to collect secrets. Saturday came cold and wet. Hogsmeade under rain had a muffled, secretive look, smoke crouching low over the roofs and puddles taking the shape of the crooked street. Students hurried between shops with hoods up and shoulders hunched. The village was full enough to hide a meeting and small enough to make concealment feel frail. Hermione took charge before they were halfway down the high street, distributing people by arrival time and reminding everyone not to cluster. Ron rolled his eyes but obeyed. Ginny, who had not been told to help and was therefore helping most efficiently of anyone, steered two nervous fourth years into honeydukes to wait until the proper moment. Neville almost walked straight past the turning to the pub because he was staring so hard at his own feet. Harry came last. He had not wanted to. Hermione insisted it would look less conspicuous if he did. By the time he reached the narrow lane, Cho was already there under a dark hood with Marietta beside her, both pretending not to be watching the door. Luna stood a little apart gazing at the inn sign as if it contained hidden messages. Ron was jammed under the eaves trying unsuccessfully to look casual. Hermione, damp curls escaping everywhere, gave Harry one quick searching look. "Still time to run," he muttered. "No, there isn't," she said. The Hog's Head crouched against the weather like a place that expected bad business and meant to survive it. Its windows were smeared with age and rain. The sign creaked overhead. From within came a dull yellow light, and the murmur of voices thickened by old walls. Harry stood for a moment with his hand on the latch. Behind him, in the rain-dark lane, students shifted and waited. Beyond them, Hogsmeade went about its Saturday trade, unaware that half a dozen schoolchildren and more than half a dozen fears had gathered outside one disreputable pub to decide whether the year would continue happening to them, or whether they would finally begin, however clumsily, to answer. Then Harry pushed the door open. The Hog's Head smelt of wet dogs, stale hops, old smoke, and a kind of institutional despair that seemed to have settled into the grain of the wood. Harry had expected dirt and found something stranger. Not neglect exactly, but a deliberate refusal of comfort. The tables were scrubbed without affection. The tankards were clean enough to satisfy the law and no cleaner. The room's single mirror looked as if it had spent years trying not to reflect too much of anybody. It was, Harry thought, precisely the sort of place in which a secret might feel naturally at home. They came in twos and threes, shaking rain from their cloaks and glancing over their shoulders before shutting the door. Hermione had organized it with the efficiency of a field marshal and the nervous insistence of somebody fully aware that they might already have made a dreadful mistake. Ron stood close enough to Harry to convey confidence if anybody was watching and panic if Harry happened to glance sideways. Ginny slipped in with a nod of fourth years, composed and bright-eyed. Neville arrived damp and pink about the ears, looking as though he had had to persuade himself through every step of the journey and was ashamed of the difficulty. Luna came dreamily last with her radish earrings swinging against her neck and greeted Harry as if clandestine meetings in disreputable pubs were a perfectly natural extension of the timetable. Cho came with Marietta Edgecombe. Harry noticed that at once. He noticed also that Marietta seemed less interested in the meeting than in the exits, and that Cho knew it. There was apology in the turn of Cho's mouth and stubbornness in the way she sat down anyway. Hermione counted heads under her breath, then counted again. 28, she murmured. No, 29. Good. It doesn't feel good, Ron muttered. It didn't. Not at first. The room was too full of expectation and not yet full of trust. Students who barely nodded to one another in corridors now found themselves crammed shoulder to shoulder under low beams, drawn by a single forbidden desire so naked it made the air feel charged. They wanted to be taught how not to die. That knowledge changed people's faces. Harry saw it one by one. The pretty vagueness that some students wore around schoolwork sharpened into seriousness. Habitual arrogance thinned into apprehension. Shyness remained shyness, but it was shyness standing up straight. Hermione rose, because if Harry had done it first, he would have sounded angry. And if Ron had done it first, he would probably have swallowed his tongue. She did not say much. She did not need to. She said the ministry would not teach them what mattered, that the situation outside the school was worse than the papers admitted, and that if anybody here believed it foolish or dangerous to learn genuine defensive magic, they should leave now before names were spoken. Nobody moved. Harry thought for a moment that nobody breathed. Then, all the various reasons for being there came out at once. A third year from Hufflepuff said her parents wanted her able to protect herself on the way home because her father worked late and their lane was lonely in winter. A Ravenclaw said his older brother had been stunned by men in masks at the Quidditch World Cup, and he had never forgotten how useless the adults around him had looked. Neville said with painful effort that his Gran thought there were dark times coming and that he did not want to be caught short. Cho said quietly that Cedric had died because Voldemort was back and everybody knew it even if they were too frightened to say so. At that, an uneasy rustle went through the room. Marietta looked down at the table. Harry had not meant to speak. He had meant to stand there, perhaps answer questions, perhaps demonstrate a curse or two, and let Hermione carry the logic of the thing. But Cedric's name in Cho's voice undid something in him. He was murdered, Harry said. The room steadied around the sentence. Rain ticked at the window. Somewhere downstairs a chair scraped. He wasn't careless, and he wasn't unlucky, Harry said. He was murdered because Voldemort came back and because the people who should be telling the truth are lying instead. If you want to leave, leave. I'm not asking anybody to do anything clever or noble. But if you stay, I'm not going to pretend theory is enough. It isn't. A shield charm matters. Stunning somebody matters. Disarming them before they curse you matters. Keeping your head when you're afraid matters. If we wait until the ministry approves all that, we'll be old enough to have grandchildren. Oh. There was a heartbeat silence, then a snort from Fred, quickly smothered. It broke the strain just enough. What about a name? Said Ginny. Association for Defensive Training, Hermione said at once. Sounds like a pamphlet, said Ron. Defense Association, suggested Cho. Fred leaned back, grinning. Dumbledore's Army. The name passed round the table in little startled glances and reluctant smiles. It was a joke, obviously. It was also an accusation, a banner, a dare. Hermione frowned as if objecting to its flippancy. Ginny looked delighted. Neville looked appalled and determined at once. Harry felt the oddest sensation in his chest, as if the room had tilted and something long dormant in him had suddenly sat up. All right, he said. It was done. On the way back to the castle, they were stopped at the edge of the village by two ministry officials in plum cloaks, carrying lanterns under weather charms. The men called it routine. They asked for names, houses, reason for travel, whether any unauthorized gatherings had taken place in Hogsmeade. Hermione produced a list of approved student purchases and looked so offended by the imprecision of their paperwork that one of them grew flustered and waved them on. Harry noticed Marietta watching every question with tightening lips. The next night, Dobby found him outside Gryffindor Tower. The little house elf appeared from nowhere with a soft crack and nearly made Colin Creevey drop his camera. "Harry Potter, sir," Dobby squeaked, wringing his long fingers together. Dobby is hearing that Harry Potter is needing a place where bad wizards is not finding him and his friends. Bad wizards, Harry repeated. Dobby nodded so hard his ears flapped. Bad ministry wizards, sir. They is asking doors to speak. They is asking paintings to listen. They is peeping in cupboards. But Hogwarts is having a place, sir, if the seeker is needing it very much. No. He told them then about the room on the 7th floor, opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy, where one must walk past 3 times while concentrating on what one required. Harry went there with Ron and Hermione after curfew, under the cloak, with his heart thudding against his ribs. The stretch of wall that had always held nothing but stone yielded instead to a smooth oak door with a brass handle warmed by the hand that had conjured it. Inside, the room glowed. It was larger than any chamber ought to have been in that part of the castle and more comfortable than any chamber at Hogwarts had ever dared to become on its own initiative. Cushions spilled over thick rugs. Bookcases groaned with defensive manuals, some modern, some so ancient their bindings looked like dry bark. There were shelves of dart detectors, practice dummies, mats, goblets full of spare wands for drill, boxes of sneakoscopes, jars of ointment, and a cabinet whose glass doors revealed row upon row of cracked shields. A fire burned low and steady beneath a broad mantel. Somebody, or something, knew exactly what frightened students would need, and had decided not to be subtle about it. Hermione turned slowly in the lamplight, her face shining. "Oh," she whispered, which was more awe than Harry had ever heard from her outside a library. Ron picked up a silver knife, weighed it, and put it back quickly. "This room," he said reverently, "is brilliant." The first meeting of the DA took place there 3 nights later. The passage of time inside the Room of Requirements seemed different from the rest of the castle. Outside, Hogwarts was becoming a ledger, a monitored route, a sequence of permissions. Inside, the old magic of the place gathered around them with the grave, attentive patience of a very old teacher who had decided that the adults currently in charge were not equal to the hour. Harry began with disarming. It was the simplest thing he knew that mattered. He spoke louder than he liked, and at first his own voice sounded unfamiliar in the room, but the spell steadied him. Neville's wand flew into the chandelier twice before it came cleanly back to his hand. Ginny knocked Zacharias Smith flat on his back with enough force to make Fred applaud. Luna's movements were dreamy right up until the moment her spell landed. Then they were devastatingly precise. Cho learned fast. Ron learned fast but showed off, which made Hermione hiss at him. Hermione herself was one of those people whose competence in ordinary schoolwork did not merely survive under pressure, but improved insultingly. By the end of the second session, Harry discovered something he had never expected to enjoy: teaching. Not authority, which he did not trust, nor being watched, which he hated, but the exact bright instant when another person understood. The room changed with each success. Fear thinned. Laughter appeared in the spaces between attempts. Students who had spent weeks folding inward under decrees and inspections began for an hour at a time to unfold again. Hermione introduced the coins on the 4th meeting. "I've charmed them," she said, laying the fake galleons on a low table while the fire turned them to little round suns. "Protean charm. They'll all change when I alter the numbers on mine. Time and date of the next meeting. That way we don't have to send notes." "Now, that's Newt-level magic," Ron said. Hermione gave a tiny shrug that meant yes, obviously. Harry picked one up. The metal was warm from her fingers. Tiny numbers gleamed on the edge. He thought, absurdly, of soldiers and stories carrying tokens from home. Then he thought of Moody talking about keys handed over one by one and realized these were keys too, but of another sort. The means by which a scattered group of frightened children might begin to act like something more dangerous than frightened children. After the meeting, as the others were leaving in clusters, Cho lingered by the door. The lamps cast a honey-colored edge along her cheek. For one dangerous second, Harry forgot everything except that he was 15, and she was close. "You were right," she said. "About what?" "That it matters." She looked back over the room where Neville was helping Luna into a cloak that had acquired inexplicably 3 extra sleeves. It already feels different. Harry wanted to say something memorable. He managed. Yeah. She smiled anyway. When he got back to Gryffindor Tower that night, there was an owl waiting for him in the common room with a ministry seal on the message tube. His stomach dropped so violently he nearly let the bird go. He cracked the seal and found, not an accusation, but a notice in clipped official language informing him that due to revised student welfare procedures, all outgoing and incoming owl post might be subject to spot inspection and delay. Students were reminded that the concealment of contraband communication methods would result in serious disciplinary consequences. Harry read it twice, then took the parchment to Hermione, who swore under her breath in a most un-Hermione-like manner. "They don't know about us," she said, though she sounded as if she were trying to convince herself. "This is broader than that. They're trying to close every channel before they even know which one matters." "Can they do that?" Ron demanded. Hermione looked toward the window, where the owl was ruffling its feathers indignantly. "They can try." Harry went to bed with the coin in his hand. Below the dormitory windows, the castle stretched into darkness. Towers, courtyards, corridors, secret doors, sleeping portraits, hidden chambers, old enchantments. Somewhere down there, behind a ministry plaque screwed onto an ancient wall, people in plum robes were making lists of students and routes and habits. Somewhere else, on a shelf beside spare shields and dark detectors, the room of requirement waited for the next knock of need. The coin lay warm in Harry's palm long after the fire had died. It occurred to him as he drifted at last towards sleep that Hogwarts had always taught its students 2 educations at once. There was the official one, printed in timetables and set in essays. And there was the one the castle itself gave: how to listen for moving stairs, how to recognize danger and laughter, how to find allies by instinct, how to make secrecy into a form of courage. This year, he thought drowsily, the 2 educations had stopped pretending to be separate. Winter came early, and not cleanly. The first snow fell while the lawns were still hard with old rain, and left the grounds patched white and green like an unfinished charm. Students began stamping in from herbology with their robes wet at the hem and their tempers shortened by cold. The ministry notices on the corridor walls curled at the edges from damp, only to be replaced by newer, flatter ones by Filch before supper. The Da met more often. Harry's detentions with Umbridge continued whenever she could arrange them. The skin on the back of his hand never fully forgot the pen. Meanwhile, Hogwarts itself learned fresh ways to be watched. Students returning from Hogsmeade found their bags checked. Packages from home arrived with little red wax marks indicating they had been opened. 2 Ravenclaws were summoned to the Educational Security Office for attempting to start an after-hours Gobstones League without approval. A 6th-year Hufflepuff had her broom confiscated for unsafe, unsupervised aerial practice. Percy Weasley's name began to appear with increasing frequency in the notes Umbridge posted, appended in small neat letters to give the authority of the minister's office to whatever pettiness she happened to be enshrining that day. At breakfast one morning, Hermione tossed down a Daily Prophet so hard that porridge splashed. On the front page, beneath a photograph of Fudge looking reassuringly grave, ran a piece about the necessity of preserving confidence in institutions of magical learning during times of agitation. Halfway down, smiling as if education were a charity ball and not a battleground, stood Lucius Malfoy among several noted benefactors, offering material support to the ministry's school review. Harry's chest went hot. "He's not even pretending," he said. Hermione's mouth was a thin line. "Look at the phrasing. Families of standing deeply concerned by reports of disorder at Hogwarts. Several respected members of the old school governance community. It's him. It's all him." "Nay." Ron bent lower over the paper. "Listen to this. Additional security provisions remain under consideration should circumstances warrant them." "What circumstances?" "The ones they create," said Hermione. Harry looked toward the teacher's table. Dumbledore was in conversation with Professor Flitwick, his face serene at a distance that by now Harry knew could mean anything from amusement to fury. Umbridge was not looking at the paper. She was buttering toast with meticulous enjoyment. The thing that happened to Arthur Weasley took place 5 nights before the Christmas holidays. Harry dreamed he was a snake again, gliding along the dark, polished floor of the Department of Mysteries. The corridor swam before him in strips of yellow light and shadow. There was hunger in him, cold and exact. There was the joy of a body made holy for striking. Then the door he had never yet reached was gone, and ahead lay a man slumped against the wall with red hair darkening under the greenish lamps. The snake launched. Harry felt the impact in 2 bodies at once, the pierce of fangs and the shudder of flesh receiving them. He woke choking on his own shout. Within minutes, the dormitory was in chaos. Neville sat bolt upright, tangled in blankets. Dean asked what had happened. Ron was on the floor, grabbing Harry's shoulders hard enough to bruise. "Wake up. Harry, wake up." "I am awake," Harry said, though the room still reeled. "Your dad, Arthur, he was down the stairs before anybody could stop him." McGonagall, white-faced and wholly awake at once, sent for Dumbledore. Portraits woke in a cascade of indignant confusion. Dumbledore appeared out of the dark with his robes unfastened, and his expression sharpened to something terrible. Harry said the words as quickly as he could. "Department of Mysteries. Corridor dot. Snake. Bitten. Die." There followed one of those sequences in which adults moved at a speed children were never meant to witness. Messages sent. Fires kindled. Heads thrust through flues. Orders clipped out in voices that left no room for doubt. McGonagall wrapped Ron in a tartan blanket because he was shaking too hard to stand straight. Hermione arrived half-dressed and put a hand over her mouth as Harry repeated himself. Within minutes, Sirius' fire-lit head flared up in the grate. Another Order member vanished at once. Harry saw Dumbledore's eyes on him only once during the whole frantic business, and in them was something not blame but a kind of grave calculation that hurt worse. Arthur lived. He lived because Harry had seen what he saw, and because the Order moved quickly, and because healers at St. Mungo's understood snakes better than politicians understood consequences. The holidays began in a blur of flu powder, trunks, hospital corridors, and Molly's exhausted tears. St. Mungo's in winter had an odd smell, potion fumes, boiled linen, singed herbs, and the faint metallic tang of too much magic recently used. Arthur lay propped among pillows, pale under his freckles, his arm bandaged to the elbow, his eyes apologetic whenever anybody came near his bed, as though being mauled by a giant serpent in the middle of the night was an inconvenience he had failed to prevent. "It was a misunderstanding," he told the twins weakly on the second day. The snake was not open to reason. Fred laughed too loudly. George stared at the bandages as if memorizing an enemy. Harry lingered at the edge of the ward whenever he could, ashamed to go near and ashamed not to. He knew, though nobody had said it in so many words, that he had been inside that attack in a way no decent person ought to be inside another man's pain. He felt watched by the adults and deserved it. Sirius tried to draw him into conversation. Lupin sat with him in a corridor lined with portraits of medieval healers and said gently that guilt was not evidence. Molly hugged him unexpectedly one evening and held on until his throat ached. The Daily Prophet stand outside the ward held nothing but lies arranged in increasingly polished order. Fudge called for calm. The ministry denied any organized dark activity. A side column announced the expansion of educational oversight measures in response to growing public concern over the safety of students amid false alarmism. Lucius Malfoy's photograph appeared again in the background of a shot taken outside the minister's office. Almost incidental, almost impossible to miss. Harry stood looking at it until the edges blurred. "Still there?" said a voice beside him. Tonks had arrived wearing her healer visitor's smile, which was less a smile than a piece of apparatus clipped on for the comfort of others. Her hair today was a subdued mouse brown that made the tiredness under her eyes more visible. "He's everywhere," Harry said. Tonks followed his gaze to the photograph. "Men like that don't need to push doors open," she said. "They stand near them and people begin holding them ajar. Arthur says he's been in and out of the ministry constantly." "Arthur says a lot of sensible things," Tonks replied. "Not all of which can be printed." She glanced over her shoulder and lowered her voice. They're talking about additional personnel at Hogwarts after the holidays. Safety stewards, monitors, call them what you like. Dumbledore won't allow it. Tonks's expression shifted, not into disagreement but into something more troubling. That depends on whether the thing is presented as an option. The words stayed with Harry. They found him again 2 nights later when he could not sleep and wandered the corridor outside the ward, past the long windows where snow drifted down the dark city beyond. He thought of Hogwarts at Christmas when he had stayed there his first year. The silence of it, the enchanted snow in the Great Hall, the peace. He thought of ministry officials turning up at the gates with papers. He thought of Dumbledore standing against that, with only authority and will, while other men came armed with panic and seals, and the support of newspapers. On Boxing Day, Sirius arrived disguised as a great black dog and had to be smuggled into a side room to resume human form. Harry laughed in spite of himself when he saw Molly scold a massive, shaggy animal for getting soot on the floor. Sirius' face, when he straightened and brushed ash from his sleeves, was alight with the reckless pleasure of having escaped Grimmauld Place at all. Yet the pleasure died quickly when Arthur, dozing, mumbled that Percy had sent a memorandum instead of a letter. "A memorandum," repeated Ginny with lethal calm. "He's with Fudge," Molly said sharply. "That doesn't mean he would." "He already has," Fred said. Nobody answered. The return to Grimmauld Place after hospital visiting hours felt less like coming home than being gathered again into the jaws of an argument. News arrived hourly, each item worse than the last. Azkaban had suffered a mass breakout. 10 prisoners gone. Dementors blamed, though Moody said with savage certainty that the Dementors had likely needed no encouragement. Fudge called it regrettable and insisted the situation was in hand. The Prophet printed speculation about unrest, sabotage, and the need for institutions to cooperate more closely with ministry guidance. Harry heard the names of escaped Death Eaters in the kitchen as adults forgot, once or twice, to keep their voices low enough. Bellatrix Lestrange, Antonin Dolohov, Augustus Rookwood, others. The names seemed to drop into the room like stones. He thought of Hogwarts with its sleeping students and great vulnerable towers. He thought of the castle as a target and felt his stomach turn over. On New Year's Eve, while the house shuddered with the muffled revelry of Fred and George attempting illegal fireworks in the attic, Arthur came home for an hour from the ministry and sat very still at the kitchen table. "They're drafting something called a Provisional School Safety Annex," he said at last. "Temporary external support, communication review, authority to restrict student movement where necessary. Fudge says it's only until confidence is restored." "No." Sirius laughed harshly. "Confidence in what? His reflection?" Arthur removed his spectacles. Without them, he looked older. "There are names attached to the proposal who were nowhere near education a month ago. Malfoy, of course, through third parties." Harry's head came up. "Avery?" Arthur glanced at him, surprised. "One of the old crowd? Never convicted. Slipped through by claiming Imperius, if memory serves." "Why?" "No reason," Harry said quickly. But the name struck him with the force of recognition. Graveyard. Hooded men. Voldemort speaking names into cold night. Avery had been one of them. Harry had not seen his face then, but names had a way of carrying their owners' shapes inside them. That night he dreamed not of snakes but of doors. He was standing in the corridor outside the Department of Mysteries again, but the locked door at the end had changed. It had become the door of the Educational Security Office at Hogwarts, brass plaque gleaming in greenish light, and when he opened it, the room within was not the office but the great hall emptied of students. On the high table sat Lucius Malfoy in Umbridge's place, writing with the blood quill on an endless roll of parchment. Every name it inscribed crawled off the page like a black insect and vanished into the stone. Harry woke with the old pain in his scar, faint but unmistakable, and the feeling that winter had not closed around the school at all. It had only given the people circling it better cover. Hogwarts after Christmas looked beautiful in the way dangerous things sometimes did. Snow lay over the lawns with a deceptive softness that turned every roofline into a clean white edge against the sky. The turrets rose blue in the late afternoon. Smoke drifted from the chimneys and the windows burned gold one by one as dusk came down. Harry had loved that sight from the train since he was 11. On this return journey the beauty was so complete it seemed almost mocking. 2 new watchfires burned at the gates. They were not campfires exactly, nor anything so crude. Magical braziers had been set in wrought iron stands on either side of the entrance, their flames burning low and green under weather spells. Beside them stood 4 witches and wizards in dark plum cloaks edged with ministry silver. They checked the names of returning students, examined trunks with practiced hands, and glanced up at the carriages as if counting not children but units. One of them wore a badge Harry had not seen before, a small brass shield over crossed wands. "School Safety Office," Hermione said under her breath, reading faster than anybody else. "That sounds made up," Ron muttered. "Most institutions are." As they passed through, one of the stewards, square-jawed, broad-shouldered, with the blankly efficient face of a man who considered suspicion a virtue, asked Harry to open his satchel. "For what?" said Harry. "Routine review." Harry opened it. The man sifted through books, parchment, a bag of fizzing Whizbees from Fred, the invisibility cloak wrapped tight at the bottom under spare socks. For a sick second, Harry thought the game was over, but the steward's fingers passed over the cloth without interest and closed the bag again. "Move along," he said. Up the drive, Draco Malfoy stood on the steps with his hands in his pockets, looking for all the world like a host watching late guests arrive to a feast already begun. Snow dusted his dark hair. When Harry met his eyes, Draco tipped his head very slightly and smiled the same thin smile he had worn in Diagon Alley. Inside, the changes were everywhere. The notice boards had become forests of directives. Students were informed that all Owl Post would now be sorted through the security office before delivery. Hogsmeade weekends were suspended pending review of external risk factors. Unscheduled gatherings of more than 4 students in corridors after supper were prohibited. All visitors were restricted by prior written approval. Teachers were requested to report unusual student interest in restricted magic, political matters, or known troublemakers. "I wonder which of us is on that last list," Hermione said. "All of us," said Harry. Dinner that night tasted of cold gravy and resentment. The teacher's table had 3 extra places filled. Umbridge seemed almost luminous with satisfaction. Dumbledore was present but remote, as if he had drawn some internal curtain over whatever he thought, and would not let the rest of the hall glimpse it. Snape's face was a mask. McGonagall's was war. Hagrid returned the following week. His arrival began as a rumor. Somebody saw movement in the trees near the edge of the grounds. Somebody else swore Fang had been heard howling under a window at dawn. By breakfast, there were 3 contradictory versions, each more ridiculous than the last, and by lunchtime it was true. Harry, Ron, and Hermione found him outside his cabin after herbology. The hut leaned into the snow under its shaggy roof, smoke puffing stubbornly from the chimney, and Hagrid stood by the pumpkin patch like a boulder that had recently lost an argument. One eye was purpled nearly shut. A yellowing bruise ran from his temple into his beard. His great coat hung stiff with old mud. "Hagrid!" Hermione cried. He turned, and the effort of smiling made him wince. All right. Just a bit of weather." "It looks like the weather hit you with a chair," said Ron. Hagrid tried for injured dignity and failed. Whatever mission Dumbledore had sent him on during the autumn had left marks too deep to be explained away, and it also, Harry thought, had left him guarded in a new fashion. He glanced not only toward the castle but toward the grounds beyond it before inviting them inside. The cabin was warm enough to make Harry's glasses steam. Fang flung himself onto Harry's lap and nearly broke 2 ribs with affection. Hagrid poured tea that tasted faintly of soot and stronger than any ordinary liquid had a right to be. "Can't stop," Hermione said. "We've got ancient runes." "Then ye shouldn't have come," Hagrid told her fondly. But his voice dropped as he added, "Keep your heads down, all right? A lot more ears about than there used to be." "Who are those people at the gates?" Harry asked. Hagrid's good eye flicked to him. "Ministry lot. We know that." Hagrid scraped a finger through his beard. Ministry lot as in the sorter follow orders first and ask what they mean later. Seen him speaking to Filch, to Umbridge, to some of the portraits. One of 'em tried to tell me where I could take Fang. Me. Yo. Nutty. And his outrage at this was so pure that Harry almost smiled. Dumbledore's letting them stay? Hermione said. Hagrid's huge face altered. He was not a subtle man, but he was loyal enough to understand the uses of silence. Dumbledore's doing what he can, he said at last. That evening, the Dia met in the room of requirement amid more tension than ever before. The coins had changed that afternoon to summon them, but half the group arrived in clumps as if hoping not to look like a group at all. Neville dropped his bag twice. Cho came without Marietta. Ginny counted heads the way Hermione usually did, and frowned when she reached the end. 23. She said she had prefect stuff, Cho said too quickly. Nobody answered. Harry pushed them through shield charms until everyone was sweating in spite of the cold. It helped. Movement helped. The room had become their answer to scrutiny, a place where purpose was plain and fear could be converted at least temporarily into practice. Yet even here the outside world pressed in. When the session ended, the coins felt not like clever devices now, but like contraband. On his way back, Harry was stopped by Snape. It happened in the corridor outside the dungeon stair, where torchlight clung to damp stone and every sound arrived already slightly hostile. Snape emerged from a side passage so abruptly that Harry, still keyed up from the meeting, went for his wand by reflex. Fascinating, Snape said silkily. Have you begun dueling the walls, Potter, or do you reserve your talents for human company? Harry lowered his hand. I was going to bed. So admirable. Snape's black eyes rested on him with their usual unnerving intensity. As it happens, the headmaster wishes your occlumency instruction to begin at once. You will attend me on Thursday evenings. Harry stared. My what? Occlumency. Snape pronounced the word like an indictment. The branch of magic concerned with shielding the mind against penetration. Since your mental door appears not merely ajar but hanging from one hinge, the necessity should be obvious even to you. He swept on before Harry could argue, cloak whispering over stone. Occlumency lessons began in Snape's office 2 days later, and instantly became the worst hour of Harry's week, not involving Umbridge's quill. Snape explained almost nothing and expected immediate competence at a discipline Harry had never heard of until 48 hours earlier. Legilimens came like a blow. Harry's thoughts cracked open under it in a helpless flood. Privet Drive. Cedric in the graveyard. The snake at Arthur's throat. Sirius laughing in Grimmauld Place. Cho by the room of requirement fire. Snape saw too much and showed disgust at all of it. Clear your mind, he said after the fourth failed attempt. Do not dwell. Do not feel. Do not hand your enemy the furniture of your soul, and then complain when he sits down. That's not helpful, Harry snapped, breathing hard. Then perhaps try being less penetrable. What Harry hated most was not Snape's contempt. That was familiar. It was the occasional flashes beneath it when Snape's own concentration slipped. A dark-haired boy cowering under a raised hand, a narrow street at dusk, a young woman laughing while leaves blew round her ankles. Then the vision slammed away, and Harry was left shaken by having seen something he did not understand, and unable even to hate Snape cleanly for it. Meanwhile, the gates remained watched, the owlry remained searched, and the Inquisitorial squad arrived. It was announced on a Friday afternoon by decree. A select body of student volunteers would assist the High Inquisitor in the school safety office in identifying rule-breaking, unauthorized assemblies, suspicious articles, and breaches of discipline. These students would receive limited supervisory powers. Their badges, to be worn visibly, would carry the authority of the ministry for school purposes. Draco was wearing one before supper. He walked the corridor outside the great hall, flanked by Crabbe and Goyle as if he had been born to a uniform. The little silver badge on his robes caught the candlelight. Pansy Parkinson looked ready to burst with borrowed pride. Several younger Slytherins practically tripped over themselves to be seen near him. Ron made an inarticulate sound of outrage. It's just a badge, Hermione said. which would have been more convincing if she had not gone pale. Draco fell into step with them, all civility. "Bad luck," he said to Ron. "Could been you with your prefect experience. But the ministry tends to prefer students whose families are more cooperative." Harry stopped dead. "Say that again?" Draco's eyes flicked to the nearest steward at the end of the corridor, then back. "Why? Everyone knows it." "What did they know?" Hermione asked in a voice cold enough to cut. "That some families understand where authority lies." Draco's smile sharpened. "And some families will learn." He moved on before Harry could lunge for him. The steward had seen everything and did nothing, which was in some ways worse. That night, Harry took the Marauder's map from his trunk for the first time in weeks and spread it on the bed, curtains around him while Ron snored beyond. The castle bloomed into life under the wand light. Tiny labeled dots moving along familiar corridors, ghosts drifting, prefects patrolling, Filch shambling, Peeves darting in erratic loops. He followed the route of the new security stewards around the entrance hall, across the second floor, toward the owlry. One stopped outside the door of the educational security office. The name over the dot was not one Harry recognized. Not because it was strange, because it was old. Not. Harry sat up so fast the bed creaked. He stared until the ink blurred, blinked, and looked again. The dot moved inside the office. Another stood near the side passage. Wilkes. No, not Wilkes. He had died, hadn't he? Harry leaned closer, pulse battering his throat. The second name resolved instead into Avery. Avery Dyatt. The dormitory seemed suddenly airless. Harry had heard Arthur say it in the kitchen. One of the old crowd. One of the men from the graveyard circle. A respectable name smuggled back into government paperwork and now walking the corridors of Hogwarts under a ministry seal. Harry folded the map with fingers that no longer felt entirely steady. Down in the depths of the castle, the school's safety office glowed politely behind a brass plaque. On parchment and decrees, in the language of welfare and procedure, the school was being bound tighter each week. But beneath the official script, other names had begun to move. After Harry saw Avery's name on the map, the whole school rearranged itself around suspicion. It did not help that nobody else could look at the map and see what he saw. Ron believed him at once because Ron's faith, once given, ran deep. Hermione believed him in the more troubling way she believed things she could not yet prove. Absolutely, but with a list of conditions forming in her head. Ginny asked whether not might mean Theodore not. Harry shook his head. Theodore was in the Slytherin dormitory on another part of the map at the same time. Hermione chewed on that and went quiet. "We have to assume they're moving through the school under ministry cover," she said at last. "If they're the same men Arthur named, then they're not random officials. They're placed." Ron scrubbed his hair back. "How does Fudge not know?" Hermione's laugh was short and without humor. "Because men like Fudge don't think infiltration looks like people they already trust." From then on, the dia split itself without anybody formally deciding to do so. Meetings were smaller. The coins were changed more often. Harry taught different things to different groups in case one session was compromised. Hermione began writing notes in the margins of homework parchments using spells that made the words vanish under ordinary light and reappear only when breathed upon. Fred and George, delighted by the challenge, improved the method by inventing an ink that only revealed itself after contact with powdered billywig wing. Ginny suggested that if they were going to run an underground organization, they ought at least to have better handwriting than revolutionaries usually did. Harry laughed, and the laugh felt strange in him. The school above their secret life grew steadily harsher. The Inquisitorial squad took to stopping younger students for the pleasure of making them empty their bags. 2 fourth years were made to write lines for laughing at a decree. Filch, newly empowered, attempted to institute one-way traffic on the third-floor corridor, until Peeves caused such uproar by directing everybody into a broom cupboard that even Umbridge was forced to rescind it. Yet, much of the new oppression was quieter, and therefore more effective. Students began lowering their voices automatically when crossing the entrance hall. People stopped lingering after class because there was always someone at the end of the corridor who seemed to have no reason to be there except to note who else was. Even the teachers seemed altered by the pressure. Flitwick looked strained. Sprout twice forgot what she was saying in the middle of a sentence and stared out toward the grounds as if listening for something. Snape moved through the castle like a blade in search of a sheath, harder and more guarded than ever. McGonagall's temper, ordinarily precise as a rapier, had become so tightly controlled that students in her class handled their transfigurations with terrified reverence. Only Dumbledore remained outwardly unchanged, and Harry had begun to understand that this, too, could be terrible. When the strongest person in the room wore calm like armor, it was difficult to know whether calm remained possible or merely necessary. Cho found Harry one evening outside Charms. "Can we talk?" she said. Her face made him nervous at once. There was too much color high in her cheeks and too little elsewhere. He followed her into a side passage where a narrow window looked out over the west lawn, silvered with frost. "It's Marietta," she said. Harry's stomach sank. What about her? She doesn't want to come anymore. Harry did not answer immediately. He knew better than to say the first thing that rose in him, which was then she shouldn't. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't wise. He leaned against the stone and made himself ask, "Why?" Cho looked down at her hands. "Her mom works at the ministry. In flu regulation. They've started asking questions at home. Not about us. Not exactly. Just where she goes, who she's with, whether anything unusual's happening at school. She's frightened." "We're all frightened," Harry said more sharply than he meant to. Cho's chin came up. "I know that." The frost on the window had feathered itself into white fronds. Harry stared at them because looking at Cho while arguing with her felt like trying to duel with one hand tied. If she's frightened enough to talk, that matters. She hasn't talked. Yet. Cho's eyes flashed. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't thought about it?" Me. The worst thing was that Harry knew she had. He also knew, from the strain at the corners of her mouth, that she was already loyal to two irreconcilable versions of the world, and that one of them was losing. It made him angrier at the ministry than he had been since the hearing in August. Their decrees did not merely punish. They set people against one another until fear itself began doing the work of tyranny. "If she comes again," he said at last, "she doesn't get any more information than she needs." Cho nodded, but it was not agreement. It was the acknowledgement of a wound. Marietta came to the next meeting and stood near the back, pale and stiff, practicing shield charms as if every motion had first to be argued through with herself. Hermione kept an eye on her. Ginny did too, more openly. Luna, who had the unnerving habit of seeing through emotional weather as if it were fog, offered Marietta a spare set of wrist guards, and was thanked with such startled gratitude that Harry almost pitied the older girl. Almost. After the session, Hermione caught Harry by the shelves of dark detectors. "We should stop using the room for a week." Harry looked round. The fire burned low. Neville and Ron were carrying practice mats back into a cupboard. Ginny was herding 2 second years toward the door. Marietta had already gone, Cho after her. The room felt as safe as it ever had, and therefore, Harry suspected, more dangerous than at any previous time. "Why?" he asked, though he knew. "Because if they've started leaning on people at home, this is the next step." He ran a hand through his hair. "If we stop now, we may not get them all back." Hermione's face, in that light, looked older than 15. "If we don't stop and she breaks, we may not get the room back." Harry looked at the coin in his hand. The edge numbers glinted. He imagined them cooling in drawers and pockets all over the castle, silent for a week, while outside the security office continued to collect lists. He imagined doing nothing. It felt too much like surrender. 2 smaller meetings, he said. Different nights. Hermione shut her eyes briefly. All right. They were both wrong. The summons came on a damp March evening that smelt of thawing earth and smoke. Harry was on his way back from Snape's office, reeling from another brutal legilimency assault in which Snape had flayed open memory after memory until Harry scarcely knew whether his own anger was shielding him or exposing him further. He rounded the corner near the tapestry of Barnabas the barmaid and saw Cho standing there alone. Something in her stillness stopped him dead. "They know," she said. The corridor seemed to contract. "Who?" "Umbridge. The office. They took Marietta after supper." Cho's voice was very level, which made it more terrible. "She was called in about her mother and didn't come back. Somebody from Ravenclaw saw her there an hour later. Harry?" The coin in his pocket was suddenly a weight like stone. "Did she have one on her?" Cho shook her head wildly. "I don't know. I don't know what she said. I came straight here." Harry yanked the coin out and turned it in his fingers. There was no time for thought. He altered the numbers to a single instruction. "Go now." Hermione Byrne, original list. His hands were shaking so badly the letters nearly blurred. The coin went hot. Somewhere across the castle, matching coins would be heating in frightened palms. "Go to Gryffindor Tower," he said to Cho. "I'm coming." "No." Her expression hardened. "Stop telling everyone to go away from danger as if it belongs to you." There was no answer to that and no time to seek one. Harry turned and ran. The castle at night had always been a place of corners and echoes. That night, it became a lung-drawing breath. Portraits shouted as he passed. A pair of second years flattened themselves to the wall. On the landing above, Draco Malfoy was coming down with 2 badges of the Inquisitorial squad at his heels, and for one wild, hopeful second, Harry thought he might get by unseen. Then Draco saw his face and smiled. "Looking for someone?" Harry did not slow. Draco lunged to block him. Harry hit him shoulder first and sent him crashing into the banister. Crabbe swore. Goyle's hand fumbled for his wand. Harry took the next flight 3 steps at a time, hearing the pursuit begin below. By the time he reached the 7th floor, the corridor outside the room of requirement was already alive with motion. Neville emerged from the opposite staircase, breathing hard. Ginny was with him, hair half out of its tie. Luna walked as though this were precisely the sort of evening she had expected. Hermione came from the other end, not running but moving with dangerous purpose, the little sign up parchment clenched in one hand. "Burn it," Harry said. "I did better," Hermione answered, and tore it cleanly down the middle. The ink vanished at once from the scraps, leaving blank pieces of parchment drifting to the floor. "Jinxed copy. If anyone gives names under coercion, they'll regret it." Ron arrived last, red-faced and furious, carrying a shield that had somehow come loose from the room's shelves. "I got your message. Is it real?" From inside the wall came a sound Harry had never heard from the room before. Not the soft yielding of enchanted stone, but the blunt impact of someone pounding on a locked door. "It's real," Hermione said. The corridor flooded with footsteps below. "Move!" Harry snapped. He had not yet decided where they were to move. The old instinct of Quidditch, act first, think in the air, had seized him. Ginny grabbed Luna's sleeve. Neville took the remaining scraps of parchment from Hermione without being asked. Ron shoved the shield into Harry's arms, then snatched it back because there was no sense in that. The whole absurd, loyal, frightened pack of them turned to run just as Umbridge's voice rose from the staircase, falsely musical and close. "Dear children," she called, "do be sensible." They scattered. Harry and Ron dived down one side passage. Hermione and Ginny vanished toward the North Tower. Luna, to Harry's astonishment, did not run at all at first, but stepped into an alcove beside a suit of armor, and became somehow less noticeable than metal. Neville pelted after Harry, nearly slipping on a rug. Behind them came the slap of boots, Draco shouting, Umbridge ordering people to seal the corridor. The castle itself joined the chase. Stairs shifted. A door that ought to have opened onto a broom cupboard instead gave Harry and the others access to a narrow servants' passage choked with dust. Ron hauled it shut behind them. Muffled voices surged past without finding them. Neville bent double, gasping. "She told," he said. Harry put both hands flat to the cold stone wall and forced himself to think. Marietta in the security office, Pale under lamplight, Cho torn between fury and fear. Hermione's jinx triggered perhaps too late. Outside in the main corridor, the hunt spread through Hogwarts under the authority of decrees and badges and ministry paperwork. Inside this little passage, 3 boys held their breath like criminals. "They'll go for Dumbledore," Harry said. Ron looked up sharply. "Why?" "Because if they've got the group, they'll say he organized it." Neville's round face had gone white. Would they arrest him? Harry thought of the watchfires at the gate, the men on the map, the photographs in the Prophet, the months of preparation disguised as administration. "Yes," he said. It was the first time he had said the truth of it aloud. From somewhere far off in the castle came the gong of a bell, then another answering it. Not the normal curfew bell. Something else. Something official. The hunt had become an operation. Harry reached the spiral staircase to the headmaster's office by a route he would never afterwards have been able to retrace. He and Ron had taken the passage behind the tapestry of dancing trolls, then a stair that shifted under them halfway down, then the long gallery of dead headmasters who snored in their frames and had to be shushed by Neville, who in his distress hissed so fiercely at a portrait of a 12th century witch that she woke and called him ill-bred. Somewhere along the way, Hermione reappeared, hair coming down and eyes blazing. Ginny came with her. Luna materialized a minute later from a direction that appeared impossible. None of them had seen Cho. None had seen Marietta again. The stone gargoyle in front of Dumbledore's office was already aside. Voices came down the moving spiral, Fudge's high with self-importance, Umbridge soft and thrilled. A voice Harry recognized with a shock as Percy's, clipped and efficient, and another, deeper one. That must be Dawlish. There were others too. Footsteps. The rustle of robes. The sound of a room crowded with intent. Harry drew the cloak over himself and motioned the others back. Ron caught his arm, but Harry shook free. The office above was brightly lit. Instruments on the tables whirred and clicked with unusual agitation. Silver devices emitted thin trails of smoke that hung under the lamplight like troubled thoughts. Fawkes stood on his perch near the desk, his scarlet plumage dulling and brightening by turns, as if fire moved beneath the feathers. Dumbledore stood beside his chair, hands folded, looking not like a man cornered but like a judge waiting to hear a tedious case. Fudge faced him with flushed cheeks and a paper trembling slightly in his grip. "Last," the minister said. "At long, long last." Umbridge stood a little behind his shoulder, pink and glistening. Percy, in immaculate ministry robes, held a leather folio against his chest, as if it were a shield. Dawlish had his wand out. Kingsley Shacklebolt stood farther back by the wall, broad and grave, one dark hand resting near, but not on his own wand. Harry's heart gave a violent leap at the sight of him. Kingsley belonged to the Order. If he was here under Fudge's orders, then every line in the school was crossing every other line at once. Dumbledore inclined his head. "Good evening, Cornelius. You are in no position for pleasantries. I find them useful in almost every position." Fudge's mouth tightened. "Your little army has been discovered." There was a beat of silence. Harry could hear his own blood. Dumbledore's gaze moved over the room and rested for the briefest instant on the place where Harry stood hidden. Harry had the wild impression that the old wizard saw through the cloak and the stone and his own skin all at once. "Indeed?" Dumbledore said. "Do not play games." Fudge thrust the parchment up as though it were a warrant from heaven. "An illegal student organization, training in combat, organized in secret, names recorded, meetings concealed from authorized review. Given the tenor of your public statements over the past year, I believe any reasonable person will draw the same conclusion, which is that you are raising a private force against the ministry." Percy shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the sentence thrilled and frightened him both. Umbridge's little eyes shone. Dumbledore looked at the parchment Fudge held. "May I?" "No, you may not." Fudge's voice cracked on the word, and he hated that it had. "You have evaded accountability for too long. Umbridge made a sympathetic noise entirely at odds with her expression. The children can be forgiven, of course. Misled, excitable, tragically vulnerable to unsuitable influences. But a headmaster who exploits their trust. "My trust," said Harry before he could stop himself. Every face in the room turned toward the empty patch of floor from which the voice had come. Ron made a muffled sound of horror somewhere below the staircase. Harry whipped off the cloak because there was no point now. There was a stunned half-second in which Fudge looked not angry but offended by the existence of surprises. "Potter!" Umbridge breathed, delighted. Dumbledore's eyes did not change. "Harry." "I started it," Harry said. "Not him." Fudge gave a harsh laugh. "How touching." "It's true." "Your truth," said Umbridge, "has not been found especially reliable." Harry ignored her. "They wouldn't teach us any defense. They wouldn't let us practice. Voldemort's back and you know he is, and you'd rather arrest people than admit it." The last words came out loud enough to rattle the instruments. Fawkes shifted on his perch. Percy looked as though he had smelled rot. Dawlish took a step forward. "Mind your tongue," Fudge snapped, color surging in his face. "You are a child." "He's a witness," said Dumbledore, and there was no softness in it now. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Fudge drew himself up. "Enough. I did not come here to debate. Albus Dumbledore, by the authority vested in me as Minister for Magic, I place you under formal suspension pending inquiry into sedition, unlawful organization, obstruction of ministry oversight, and conspiracy with known subversive elements." "Nice. Subversive," murmured Dumbledore. "I confess I had hoped for something more original." Dawlish raised his wand fully. Umbridge's hand fluttered as if smoothing the air. Kingsley did not move. Harry felt in that instant not fear for himself, but a cold, vast terror for the school. If Dumbledore went, everything Moody had said in Grimmauld Place would complete itself. The paperwork, the offices, the inspections, the stewards at the gate. Those had been not the occupation but the preparation for it. Dumbledore looked round the ring of ministry faces. His expression was almost one of pity. "Cornelius," he said, "I have no wish to harm any person in this room, but neither, I think, do I have any intention of accompanying you." Fudge barked, "Take him." Everything happened at once. Dawlish lunged forward. Kingsley moved too, not against Dumbledore, but somehow not for Fudge either. An infinitesimal angle of stance that blocked one line of fire and opened another. Umbridge shrieked. Percy dropped the folio. Harry flung up an arm, though he had no idea why. Dumbledore did not draw his wand in any ordinary way at all. It seemed simply to appear in his hand as if the air had realized too late that it belonged there. There was a burst of white gold light so fierce that the portraits cried out. The silver instruments toppled, chiming madly. The office door banged shut of its own accord. Dawlish crashed into a table and went over it. Fudge stumbled backward into Percy. Umbridge screamed again, but this time in honest fear. Fawkes gave a single cry that filled the room with fire. Not consuming fire. Not heat. Something older and cleaner. For a second, Harry could see nothing but scarlet wings and light like the heart of a forge. Then it collapsed inward, and where Dumbledore had stood there was only the smell of smoke, the faint drift of phoenix feather, and a small blackened scorch mark on the floorboards. Silence followed so hard it rang. Fudge's face had gone mottled purple. He has escaped," said Kingsley, in the deep calm voice of a man offering an obvious conclusion to fools. He stooped to retrieve Percy's fallen folio as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Umbridge's breath came in fast little gasps. "Arrest the boy," she said. "No?" Dumbledore's voice said from nowhere. The word was not loud. It seemed instead to arrive from all parts of the room at once. From the portraits, the carved shelves, the dark corners near the ceiling. Harry felt it like a hand on the shoulder. "Whatever organization exists among the students," said the bodiless voice, mild as ever, "was mine." I would be most displeased to hear of disciplinary excess in my absence." Then even the echo went. Nobody moved. It was Fudge who recovered first, not because he was braver than the others, but because rage gave him somewhere to put humiliation. "Dolores," he said, breathing hard, "you will assume direct charge of the school at once. All known associates of this group are to be identified and confined to house until further notice. The safety annex is activated immediately. Full cooperation from staff will be expected." "Full cooperation, do you hear me?" "No." Umbridge looked as if Christmas, Easter, and her own coronation had all arrived in the same envelope. "Of course, Minister." Percy had regained his folio, and with it some measure of color. Dawlish sat dazed amid broken silver instruments, rubbing his head. Kingsley's face was unreadable. Harry stood frozen at the foot of the desk, feeling the office tilt around him. Dumbledore was gone. The Phoenix had left ash on the floor. And the school, in the instant after that departure, had changed hands not by conquest but by vacancy. Someone seized Harry's shoulder. He turned, expecting Umbridge or Dawlish, and found Snape in the doorway, black eyes blazing with a fury so controlled it looked like emptiness. "Out," Snape said. It was a command to Harry, to the room, perhaps to all of them. Harry went because Ron had reappeared at the threshold white as parchment, and because Snape's tone contained something beyond dislike. He stumbled down the spiral with the others, hearing above him Fudge already issuing further orders, Umbridge purring assent, Percy listing procedural steps in a voice that only shook once. At the bottom, the gargoyle swung back into place. The stone closed over the office like a tomb. Umbridge became headmistress before breakfast. The announcement appeared overnight in 4 different corridor locations, and at each entrance to the Great Hall, sealed with an embossed ministry crest that looked obscenely official against the old stone. By the time students came yawning down to porridge, the hall was thick with rumor, shock, and the strange bright energy that can seize a place when the unthinkable has already happened, and therefore lesser horrors no longer seem impossible. Dumbledore's chair remained at the center of the high table, but it had been moved back by inches and draped with a strip of black cloth as if to indicate not mourning but administrative inconvenience. Umbridge sat beside it, not in it, which somehow made the spectacle worse. The new plum-cloaked stewards lined the walls of the hall like ornamental threats. Draco and the Inquisitorial squad took up positions near the doors. Percy's office, students learned by noon, had been established temporarily in one of the old guest chambers off the second-floor landing. Filch had acquired a whistle. Harry sat between Ron and Hermione, feeling as if he had gone half-deaf. Sounds arrived late and oddly flattened. Around him, people stared at the front of the hall and then away, looked at Harry and then away, bent over their plates and barely ate. Slytherin table talk crackled with excitement. Several Ravenclaws appeared physically sick. The Hufflepuffs wore the set expressions of a house that disapproved, but had not yet decided how openly. Hermione's hand crept under the table until it found Harry's wrist. He had not realized he was shaking. "Eesh," she murmured. "I'm not hungry. I don't care." He obeyed because the steadiness in her voice gave him something to lean on. Ron, who in moments of genuine alarm became either useless or magnificent, and never knew which until afterward, shoved the toast rack closer with a muttered, "Don't let the cow see you stop." Lessons continued, which was perhaps the clearest sign that an occupation had begun. True catastrophe would have rung bells in emptied corridors. This was subtler. Children were expected to keep the timetable while the powers above them rearranged the terms of obedience. Yet each lesson carried a new undertone. In Transfiguration, McGonagall was so severe that no one dared whisper. In Potions, Snape assigned an essay on antidotes and stalked between tables with the air of a man supervising a truce he did not trust to last until the end of the hour. In Defense, Umbridge no longer bothered to couch her classes in pedagogical language at all. She lectured on the civic dangers of alarmism and assigned lines to any student whose face expressed too much of what they thought. The DA did not meet for 8 days. This was not caution exactly. Caution implied choice. They were pinned. Every corridor seemed to have acquired an observer. The coins remained cold in pockets. Harry passed Neville twice, and each time Neville gave the tiniest nod, as if to reassure him that silence was not collapse. Ginny intercepted Hermione near the library, and whispered that younger students were already being stopped and questioned about who they associated with. Luna floated through the tension as though she recognized it from some prior, stranger universe, and had found it unremarkable there as well. Cho did not approach Harry at all. Marietta appeared once in the corridor outside Charms with angry purple pustules across her cheeks that spelled sneak whenever the light caught them right. Students looked and looked away. Cho walked beside her rigidly. Harry felt the sight like a bruise. Hermione, on seeing the girl, went pale, then set her mouth with such terrifying finality that Ron later told Harry he was glad to be on the correct side of her forever. The first open violence came 2 nights later. Harry was in the common room attempting to read an essay on giant wars with less success than the subject deserved when there came a roar from outside unlike any ordinary school disturbance. It was not Peeves. It was not Quidditch practice gone wrong. It was the sound of many people shouting at once under the open sky. The whole room surged toward the windows. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny were first through the portrait hole and onto the staircase. By the time they reached the entrance hall, students were already spilling onto the steps in dressing gowns, sweaters, bare feet, untied scarves, dragged by alarm. Down on the lawn, wand light flashed. Hagrid stood near his cabin, immense against the night, Fang barking himself hoarse beside him. Around him moved 6 ministry wizards and witches with wands out, their spell lights splintering blue and white across the dark. Umbridge stood farther back under a lantern charm with Draco and several members of the Inquisitorial squad at her shoulder, not near enough to danger to risk anything, near enough to claim association with victory. "They're trying to arrest him," Hermione said, and her voice cracked. No one on the steps hesitated then. Teachers were already moving past them, McGonagall in tartan dressing gown and hat astonishingly. Professor Sprout in an old cloak thrown over her nightdress, Flitwick darting along with wand raised. Snape came last and fastest, black against the torchlight, saying something sharp Harry could not hear. Hagrid bellowed, "I ain't done nothin'." A stunner struck the side of his coat and did almost nothing. Another hit his shoulder. He staggered, then straightened with a roar that made the night itself seem to jerk. Umbridge's voice rang out thin and excited. "Useful force. Have you lost your mind?" McGonagall shouted, striding out onto the grass. What followed burned itself into Harry so deeply that afterward parts of it came back to him in dreams with the colors exaggerated beyond nature. Hagrid wrenching a man's wand away and snapping it by accident in his fist. Fang yelping and darting under the pumpkins. Sprout hurling some curse that exploded a patch of turf into writhing roots. Flitwick's voice, impossibly high and furious. Draco taking one involuntary step back when Hagrid turned his head. And McGonagall, thin and upright against the dark, advancing on the ministry line, as if outrage itself were armor. Then 4 stunning spells hit her at once. She fell without a sound. For one impossible second, everything stopped. Even Hagrid. Harry's own shout tore his throat raw. Students surged forward. Teachers flung themselves toward McGonagall. Umbridge called for order in a voice almost hysterical with triumph and fear. Hagrid made a noise Harry had never heard from any human being, snatched Fang under one arm as if he weighed nothing, and crashed through the edge of the pumpkin patch toward the dark line of the Forbidden Forest. Spells followed him, splintering bark from trees, setting one shrub briefly ablaze. None halted him. His huge shape vanished between the trunks. "Professor McGonagall!" Hermione cried. Teachers knelt around the fallen witch. A stretcher appeared. Filch blew his whistle in frantic, meaningless bursts. Umbridge shrilled that students were to return inside immediately. Draco, face white, tried to seize authority over a crowd far too horrified to notice him. Harry found himself on the marble steps with his wand out, and absolutely no memory of drawing it. Snape was suddenly in front of him, one arm barring his way so hard it drove Harry back a pace. "Back to your house," Snape said. Harry barely recognized the voice. It was low, urgent, and so close to fear that for a second his mind refused the evidence. "They hit her." "Back," Snape repeated, and his eyes cut once toward Umbridge, then toward the forest where Hagrid had vanished. Now, Ron had Ginny by the sleeve. Hermione was crying openly. Furious tears she seemed ashamed of even while they fell. Students were being herded inward by teachers who looked half mad with shock. Outside on the grass, the spell-light ebbed. McGonagall's still form moved at last on the stretcher toward the castle doors. The school woke the next morning to another decree. The grounds were now under emergency curfew from dusk till dawn. Unauthorized contact with gamekeepers, grounds staff, centaurs, or any forest-dwelling beings was prohibited. Any student found spreading alarmist accounts of last night's regrettable incident would face expulsion proceedings. Regrettable incident. Hermione stood before the notice in a silence more frightening than rage. Ron read the phrase aloud twice, as if repetition might make it less monstrous. Harry looked down the corridor and saw younger students already memorizing the new boundaries with the obedience of fear. That afternoon, the coins in their pockets grew hot for the first time in over a week. Hermione had changed the numbers to a single word. Tonight. The room of requirement was packed by the standards they now lived under, which meant 15 people and all the windows darkened. Harry stood by the fire and looked at the faces ringed around him. Ron grim and ready, Hermione white but steady, Ginny burning with contained fury, Neville with his jaw set, Luna calm as moonlight, two younger Hufflepuffs clearly terrified and refusing to leave, Cho at the back with her hands clenched. "Nobody goes near the grounds," Hermione said first before Harry could. "Nobody goes near Umbridge. Nobody speaks names in corridors. We don't help by handing ourselves over." "But we do help," said Ginny. The words went through the room like a spark. Harry realized, listening to them speak in turn, that the DA had crossed some invisible line while he was not looking. They had begun as frightened students wanting practical lessons. They sat here now not merely wanting to protect themselves, but needing to decide what kind of people they would be under rule they despised. Neville said younger students were being questioned. A Hufflepuff girl said her brother in second year had had his bag searched 3 times in one day. Luna observed that the castle itself seemed angrier than usual because 2 suits of armor had kicked an Inquisitorial member when he tried to pin a notice to them. Fred and George, arriving late with singed cuffs and the expressions of men recently inspired by chaos, announced that several lavatories on the 2nd floor were now intermittently producing swamp water. For the first time since Dumbledore vanished, laughter broke over the room in a real wave. Harry let it come and then said, "We keep each other informed. We move in pairs. If you're called to the security office, someone knows before you go and waits after. If they want this place quiet, we don't help them by becoming quiet for them." "Mai?" He did not say fight. Not yet. The word waited at the edge of all their thoughts. Later, as the others drifted out under cover of staggered times, Hermione lingered by the shelves. "You know this is worse now," she said. "Whatever happens next will be worse." Harry looked into the fire. In the shifting light, the room seemed larger than before, as if it had stretched to hold the fear they kept bringing to it. "I know. Do you wish Dumbledore had taken us with him?" she asked. The question hurt because a part of him had wished exactly that in the first raw hours after the escape. Wished for a phoenix flame to tear the roof off the school and carry all of them somewhere beyond decrees and blood quills and ministry seals. But wishes of that kind belonged to childhood, and childhood had begun slipping from Hogwarts the moment McGonagall fell. "No," Harry said. Hermione studied him, then nodded once. She understood. Not because staying was safe. Because the school had become the place where the lie was being tested, and if they all looked away from it now, the lie would spread unopposed. That night Harry climbed to the astronomy tower alone after curfew, cloak wrapped round him against the wind. Below, the grounds lay black and silver under a cloud-torn sky. Torches moved near the gates. Another pair moved along the wall by the owlery. One glimmered through the kitchen courtyard. The school was lit from within by warm windows, but the warmth no longer seemed to belong wholly to those inside. On the lawn below, at the place where McGonagall had fallen, frost had silvered the grass. Harry stood with the cold biting through robe and jumper, and thought of Grimmauld Place, of Moody saying fortresses were lost by keys surrendered one at a time. Hogwarts had not been stormed. It had not been breached by giants or dragons or an army battering at the gates. It had been walked into by people carrying authority and sharpened by people carrying fear. From the tower height, the watchfires at the gates looked like eyes. The final lock was turned 3 days later. It happened so quietly at first that half the castle did not understand what had been lost until nightfall proved it. Owl Post failed to arrive at breakfast. By lunch, the owlery was closed under ministry authority for a temporary health inspection. Students attempting to send messages by school owls were told, with polished regret, that external communications had been suspended until further notice due to credible concerns regarding the spread of destabilizing rumors. The flue in McGonagall's office had already been sealed. By afternoon, the fat lady would not permit any student from another house to enter Gryffindor Tower without written permission countersigned by a prefect and a steward. The library's restricted section was placed under special lock. Even the hospital wing required a pass after supper. "Health inspection," Ron said at dinner, stabbing his potatoes as if one of them were personally responsible. "Off the owlery." Hermione did not answer. She was watching the high table. Umbridge had begun sitting in the middle chair now. Not every meal. Perhaps some remnant of superstition still made her uncertain. But that evening she took it. The effect was worse than vanity. Seated beneath the enchanted ceiling with the staff spread in uneasy lines to either side, she looked like a counterfeit coin hammered in the image of rulership. At the walls stood the plum-cloaked stewards. Near the doors, badges gleaming, the Inquisitorial squad kept their little line. Draco's expression contained the dazzled certainty of a boy who believed history had finally recognized him. Harry was watching the walls too. He had taken the Marauders' map to an empty classroom after lunch with Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Neville, and Luna crowding the desk. The map showed the castle in all its dangerous intimacy, black lines and labeled footsteps weaving through the old geometry. Among the familiar names moved others now with alarming regularity. Avery between the security office and Umbridge chambers. Not in the old guest corridor near Percy's temporary office. 2 stewards whose names changed on the parchment when they crossed certain thresholds, as if hiding one allegiance under another. Harry had never seen the map behave like that. At one point, a dot marked Travers had appeared near the gates for 6 breaths, and then vanished entirely. Hermione had gone so still that Ron asked whether she felt ill. "They're using alias charms or polyjuice or both," she said. "The map is catching them between layers." "What does that mean?" Neville asked. "It means," Harry said, staring at the little wandering names, "that they're not even bothering to keep the same people in the same disguises anymore." He had folded the parchment only when footsteps sounded outside. The memory of it still lay under his skin now as he sat in the great hall and watched Umbridge rise to speak. "Due to the regrettable increase in disorderly behavior and the ongoing circulation of false and alarming stories," she said, "the Ministry has deemed it necessary to enact temporary comprehensive measures to ensure student safety and educational continuity. Effective immediately, all unsupervised movement after supper is prohibited. Students will remain within house boundaries unless attending class or holding written authorization. All correspondence, internal and external, falls under review. Call. Repeated infractions will be taken as evidence of deliberate subversion." "No." The word passed through the hall like a draft. Nobody spoke. Cutlery settled. Somewhere at Ravenclaw table a goblet tipped and rang against stone. Umbridge smiled with ghastly gentleness. "I am sure that the cooperative among you will find these provisions barely inconvenient." She sat. For a long moment the hall remained suspended in disbelief. Then murmurs broke everywhere at once. Hufflepuff table rose in a low, angry buzz. A Slytherin near the front laughed. Two younger Gryffindors looked close to tears. Teachers exchanged glances over the heads of students like soldiers unable to reach one another across a field. Harry felt the old anger come up, hot and blinding. He could stand now, shout now, and half the hall would hear him before they dragged him out. He knew exactly how it would end, with Umbridge pleased, with Draco triumphant, with 3 more decrees posted before breakfast, and perhaps expulsions to follow. McGonagall was gone. Dumbledore was gone. Rage wanted a performance because performance was immediate. Resistance wanted time. He rose anyway. Ron's hand shot out, but Harry only took his school bag from under the bench and slung it over one shoulder. Hermione understood first. Her fingers tightened once around the edge of the table, then she stood as well. Ginny followed. Neville, pale but resolved, pushed back his bench. Luna rose with dreamy composure as if joining a queue for tea. Around them a dozen eyes turned, half expecting drama. Instead, the 6 of them walked from the hall at an ordinary pace. Draco moved to block the door. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked. "To bed," said Hermione coolly. "Under new regulations." "Under old common sense," said Ginny, and shouldered past him so neatly that for a second he forgot to stop her. Harry looked at Draco as he passed and saw, under the badge and the arrogance, a tremor of uncertainty. Draco had wanted power in the school the way boys wanted titles and stories. He had not wanted fear thick enough to taste in the Great Hall. He had not wanted to stand in the doorway while the castle went silent around him like a held breath. The empty classroom they chose afterward lay 2 corridors beyond the library, and had once belonged to astronomy for some temporary purpose years ago. Dust filmed the desks. A sphere model of the moon sat broken on a shelf. Rain tapped faintly at the windows, though the sky beyond was clear. The room of requirement had become too risky for a full council, and perhaps that was fitting. Resistance, Harry was learning, could not live entirely in places designed to be comfortable. He spread the map again. The others leaned over it in the dim wandlight, their heads almost touching. Harry felt, with a force that surprised him, the solidity of them. Ron's sleeve brushing his. Hermione's breath quick but steady. Ginny's hair catching amber where the wandlight struck it. Neville's big, careful hands braced on the desk. Luna gazing at the moving names, as if she were reading an especially interesting poem. "There," Harry said. The dot labeled Avery crossed the entrance hall toward the High Inquisitor's office. Nott was already inside. Travers flickered into existence near the gates. 2 disguised stewards moved from the owlery to the 2nd floor where the staff rooms lay. "They're placing themselves by every exit," Hermione said softly. "Not every exit," said Luna. They all looked at her. She pointed with one pale finger to a narrow route on the map between the tapestry corridor and an old stair that ended, if Harry remembered right, behind a statue on the 4th floor. "That staircase only opens when someone walks down it backward while thinking about violets." Ron stared. "How do you know that?" "I fell through it once." No one asked for more. Harry bent over the map again. The lines of the castle, once merely useful, had become beautiful to him in a new and painful way. They were not abstract. They were options, choices, hidden arteries in a body under pressure. "We can still move," he said. "Barely," Hermione replied. "Barely is movement." Ron exhaled hard through his nose. "So what are we now, then?" The question hung above the desk. It might once have had joking answers. "A club. A study group. Dumbledore's army," said with a grin. "Not now." Harry thought of the blood quill, of McGonagall falling under spell light, of Arthur in hospital, of Marietta's face, of Dumbledore vanishing in Phoenix fire and leaving behind a school that had changed ownership in the pause after astonishment. He thought of Moody's fist of a house and his warning. He thought of Lucius Malfoy standing under Diagon Alley's awning with one hand on a ministry sleeve. Most of all, he thought of the Great Hall 5 minutes ago, full of frightened students swallowing protest because they did not yet know who else would stand. "We're witnesses," he said first. "So they can't write this the way they want." Hermione nodded slowly. "We're messengers," said Ginny. "We're watchmen," said Neville, surprising himself into firmness. "We're very probably something Rackspurts would admire," Luna added. Ron gave a short, unwilling laugh. "Right, those two." Harry looked once more at the map, then folded it with care. "No," he said, and now the true answer had found him. "We're the people who stay." They left the classroom in pairs. Neville with Luna, Ginny with Hermione. Ron last of all, lingering at the door to look back at Harry. "You know this is war now," he said. Harry met his eyes. It was not melodrama in Ron's voice, nor fear, but recognition. Something of the same recognition that had passed through the DA when the first spells flew in practice, when the first names were hidden, when the first adults failed them. Childhood did not end in a clean cut. It frayed. It burned. Sometimes it was confiscated with your letters and your freedom of movement, and the right to cross your own school after dark. "I know," Harry said. When Ron had gone, Harry stood alone in the dusty room with the folded map in his hands and listened to Hogwarts at night. The castle was not silent. It never had been. Pipes hummed in the walls. A distant stair groaned. Somewhere a door shut with old impatience. From very far away came the faint boom of wind against a tower window. Yet beneath those familiar sounds lay the new rhythm he had begun to hear since Christmas. Patrol boots, paused voices, the measured interruption of other people's authority laid across the life of the school like bars. He went at last to Gryffindor Tower under the cloak, moving through passages now lit not only by torches but by observation. At the turn above the entrance hall, he looked down. Umbridge stood below with Avery and one of the changing named stewards, their heads bent over a sheaf of parchment. Draco waited slightly apart, Badge catching the torchlight, eager and uneasy both. The green watchfires at the gates burned through the open doors beyond like captured poison. For an instant, the whole arrangement seemed to Harry not like a school administration, nor even a conspiracy, but a court. Petty, frightened, vicious, dressed in rules, and lit by borrowed power. He kept his place in the shadows until they moved on. Then he slipped upward, through the old stone and the dark, while in pockets and desk drawers and under pillows throughout the castle small warm coins lay ready for the next message. Hogwarts had not fallen in a single night. It had been taken by signatures, by inspections, by carefully planted fear, by adults who called seizure safety and silence discipline. It had been taken corridor by corridor and key by key, until the ancient school woke to find strangers directing its breath. But the castle was not empty of its own defenders. Not yet.